You're listening to a podcast by Way Collective, a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. This recording was the conversation starter at our dinner and dialogue gathering on July 22nd, 2026. Thanks for tuning in. So I want to begin tonight's conversation with a question. Have you ever walked into a gathering like this and quietly wondered to yourself, what am I doing here? Like maybe you've never said it out loud, maybe you've only felt it. You know, we ask these questions like, am I here because I'm lonely? Am I here because I'm looking for friends? Am I here because I miss church? Am I here because I'm looking for God? Am I here because I'm trying to come home to myself? Am I here because life's become so busy that I need one evening each week to remember what actually matters? I suspect that every one of us has walked through those doors carrying some version of those questions. And what fascinates me is that in an increasingly secular world, people keep asking them. Fewer and fewer people are identifying as religious, and many are much more comfortable saying they're spiritual but not religious. And honestly, I understand why. Religion's often carried tremendous beauty into the world, but religion has also often carried tremendous harm into the world. Wars, crusades, exclusion, identity politics, violence committed in God's name. It's understandable that many people hesitate to embrace religion today. But I think in all of these conversations, we often skip over an even deeper question. Instead of asking whether religion is good or bad, what if we asked why religion appeared at all? Why did human beings across cultures and continents independently begin gathering around rituals and stories and sacred meals and songs and symbols and shared practices? Why do we seem to have evolved this impulse? Because if that instinct keeps appearing throughout history, perhaps it's telling us something more important about what it means to be human. Historians often point to what has come to be called the Axial Age, roughly 800 to 200 years before the time of Christ. And something remarkable happened during that period. Across Persia and India, China, Israel, Greece, people began asking deeper questions. Questions about justice, compassion, meaning, the inner life, what makes a good society, what makes a good person. And without obvious direct coordination among these cultures, many of the world's great religious and philosophical traditions began taking shape. Whether or not every historian agrees on every aspect of the axial age theory isn't really my point. But the point is that something deeply human emerged everywhere across the globe all at once. Human beings discovered that we don't simply survive by finding enough food, we survive by finding enough meaning as well. We don't simply need shelter, we need purpose and belonging. We need stories that remind us what deserves our love and attention. We need communities that continually reorder our desires toward what is beautiful, compassionate, generous, and life-giving. Because religion at its best became one of the primary ways human beings did exactly that. It wasn't simply about explaining the universe. It was about learning how to inhabit it well. It helped communities remember what mattered most. And perhaps that's why every religious tradition developed practices, meals and songs and pilgrimages and prayers, silence and meditation and celebration and fasting and forgiveness. Because practices shape people. They slowly teach us what to notice, and whatever we learn to notice eventually becomes what we love. And I wonder if that's one of the great losses of modernity. The scientific revolution gave humanity extraordinary gifts, right? Medicine and technology and longer lives, greater knowledge of the natural world. And I would never want to give those things back. But alongside those gifts, many thinkers have suggested that something else happened. We became what scholars call increasingly disenchanted. We became wonderfully skilled at explaining the world while gradually forgetting how to stand in awe before it. And knowledge became primarily intellectual, and truth became something to possess, and reason became detached from ritual. And the question shifted from how shall we live together to what can I prove? And somewhere along the way, many of us lost something profoundly human. Not God and not necessarily faith, but our capacity to encounter the world and one another as sacred. So today we find ourselves asking an interesting question. If fewer people participate in religious communities, where do those deep human longings go? The longing for meaning doesn't disappear. The longing for belonging doesn't disappear. And this longing to devote ourselves to something larger than ourselves doesn't go anywhere. It simply finds another home. So one possibility is nihilism, right? You can come to the conclusion that life has no meaning. Nothing ultimately matters. We're simply highly evolved accidents, and many people sincerely arrive there, and I'm not dismissing them for it. Right? That's one possibility. But another possibility is that we simply transfer our devotion somewhere else. And many scholars have suggested that as traditional religion has declined, wealth and power have quietly become our new sacred objects. Think about it for a second. Our culture constantly asks us the same questions. How productive are you? How influential are you? How successful are you? How optimized are you becoming? How much do you own? What image of yourself are you selling? Those become liturgies in themselves too. Those become rituals as well. Capitalism has its own sacred calendar and its own practices, its own confirmation classes, its own vision of salvation. And if we're not paying attention, we just begin speaking its language without even realizing it. That brings me to what has become one of my own simplest definitions of religion. Religion is a language that we learn to speak and a community of practices we learn to keep that help us render the world as sacred to ourselves and then live together as though that is the case, right? I love that image because language doesn't simply describe reality, language shapes reality. Before we learn the words like love, hopefully we've experienced love, right? Before we learn the word grief, we likely felt the grief in our bones. Languages give us a way to recognize what has always been there. And religion, at its best, does something very similar. It teaches us how to name goodness and beauty and forgiveness and wonder and mercy and belovedness and grace and justice. It gives us words and practices that help us perceive dimensions of life we might otherwise overlook. Or if we're not overlooking them, at least we're not prioritizing them, right? And this is where Jesus becomes important to me as a teacher, because Jesus wasn't simply teaching new ideas. He was teaching people a new language. He gathered strangers around tables and washed feet and forgave enemies and blessed bread, and he healed bodies and he welcomed outsiders. Again and again, he gave people practices that retrained their imaginations. He was teaching them how to see the world differently, how to recognize every person as bearing infinite worth, and how to see God's presence beyond the walls of the temple and discover that the kingdom of God wasn't somewhere else, but that it was already breaking open within ordinary life. And that's why I appreciate something the late theologian John Cobb once called secularizing Christianity. At first, that phrase sounds a little strange, right? It sounds like giving Christianity away. But that's not what he means. He means allowing Christianity to turn its attention back toward the actual world with its actual needs, toward the suffering of our neighbors, toward systems of oppression, toward ecological devastation, toward racial injustice, toward poverty, and toward loneliness, toward everything that God already loves. After all, our own scriptures tell us the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. And so if the whole world belongs to God, then the whole world should become the proper concern of spiritual communities. Our traditions were never meant to exist for themselves. They exist to help heal the world. And this is one place where I find myself gently questioning the phrase, spiritual but not religious. Again, I understand it. I totally get it. And many of us have good reasons for saying it. But I sometimes wonder if, without communities of shared practice, spirituality slowly becomes another individual project, another optimization strategy, another way of becoming the best version of ourselves. It can end up mirroring consumer culture more than the way of Christ. Because the deepest transformation rarely happens alone. It happens around tables and through friendships and through disagreements and forgiveness, through shared meals, through serving one another, through communities that patiently teach us another way of being human. And some scholars have even suggested that we may be living through another kind of axial moment. For the first time in history, nearly every major wisdom tradition is available to us at the touch of a screen, right? We can learn from Buddhist teachers and Jewish scholars, Christian mystics and Muslim poets, Hindu philosophers and humanist thinkers. Never before has humanity had this kind of access as we do during the information age. And teacher Richard Rohr often speaks of this as the perennial tradition, right? And I appreciate much of that vision, but I find myself wanting to say something slightly different. I don't think we need one universal religion where all paths diverge into one. I think we need deeply rooted people in particular places with particular wisdoms, people who know one sacred language well enough that it opens them toward every other language of wisdom. For me, Christianity is that language, simply for no other reason than it was the one given to me. It was given to me the way my given name is Timothy. I didn't have much of a choice in the matter, right? But its stories, its sacraments, its symbols, its seasons, and its songs, really its vision of Christ, these have become my mother tongue. They are the language through which I have learned to recognize the sacred in the world. And Rohr has this beautiful line that I know many of you know. He says, Christ is just our word for it. And I love that because I think the sacred is spoken in many tongues. Many of us here speak Christianity, but others speak Buddhism or Judaism or Kriya Yoga or humanism. Some of us are still even discovering our language and what resonates for us. And what beautiful company that makes, doesn't it? Because each tradition at its best teaches its people how to recognize beauty and compassion and justice and mercy and love, and then embody those realities in community. Do you see why this matters so much in a time like ours? The question isn't whether human beings will become devoted to something. We always will. The real question is, what will shape our devotion? What language will teach us how to see? What practices will train our hearts, and what community will continually remind us what deserves our deepest love? Friends, I think that's what we've been quietly doing here at Way Collective all along. Every Wednesday, as we share meals and listen deeply and practice silence, we're learning from one another. We're holding disagreements with gentleness. We're cultivating our shared values, right? And practices, connection and curiosity, creativity and compassion and consciousness and collaboration. These aren't simply just nice values. They're the vitality of being a human being. They're the practices that slowly teach us another way of seeing the sacred, another way of belonging, another way of becoming human together. And perhaps maybe that's what you've been searching for every time you walk through these doors. Not certainty or belief, and especially not religious performance, but a community that keeps helping you remember that this world is still sacred and that every person bears infinite dignity and that love remains stronger than fear. And that together we can become people who carry that vision back into a world that desperately needs it. Because perhaps religion at its very best has never been about escaping the world. It's always been about learning to love it well. All right, I'm looking forward to talking about this with you all tonight. So here are our 3 contemplative questions for conversation. The first question is the self question. Where did you first learn the language of what matters most? And how has that language shaped the person that you've become? The second question is the sacred question. How has your understanding of God or the sacred expanded because of someone from a different tradition or perspective? And lastly, the society question. What religion do you think our culture is quietly practicing today? What societal values is it teaching us to worship? Thanks for listening to this podcast by Way Collective. To keep up with our community, you can subscribe to this podcast, visit www.waycollective.org, or follow us on Instagram at @waycollective. Peace and every good, y'all.